All right, welcome back. Here we are on part two of our story on Martin Luther and the Reformation. We spent most of our time in part one looking at causes of the Reformation, different issues that existed within the Catholic Church, which are going to be used by Martin Luther to really change Christianity forever. So let's go ahead and look at Martin Luther's story here. So Luther challenges the church. Now, Luther's parents wanted him to be a lawyer. However, he became a monk and a teacher instead. He's going to be a very educated man. He's going to have many different degrees. He will teach scripture at the University of Wittenberg, which is in the German state of Saxony. Germany at this time was organized into several different states, in a way like the United States is today. So he's going to spend most of his time in Wittenberg. It's pronounced with that V sound because you're in Germany. Wittenberg, which was in the German state of Saxony. Now, his 95 Thesis is what's going to begin the Reformation. We're going to specifically talk about that here in a little bit, but it was customary for this time period for you to, if you had grievances, you decided that you were going to post them on the door of the church. That's what you did. It was almost like a community bulletin board. So when Martin Luther gets very upset with the church, he basically writes as a letter his 95 Thesis, which was his list of grievances that he had against the church. One of the things we're going to talk about is Martin Luther believed it was okay for clergy to marry, and even he himself did so, which is going to help us separate Protestantism from Catholicism, which is really where we're going with all of this. The Catholic Church is going to see a division, and this division still exists in the modern world today. You have Catholics and you have Protestants, and they're all Christian, but because of Martin Luther, Protestantism, from the root word protest, has some different rules, some different practices than that of the Catholic Church. So that is what we are building up to here. Here's a map of Germany. You can see Poland over here. Excuse me. You can see Germany here, and right in the middle you have Saxony. You can see it right there, and there is Wittenberg. So it kind of gives you an idea of middle of Europe here, kind of what was going on here at the time of Martin Luther. All right, let's talk about those 95 Theses. Luther took a very strong stand against Johann Tetzel, who was selling indulgences to pay for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. We watched the film Luther in my class, and you saw John Tetzel. John is a German name. In German, it would be Johann, who was selling indulgences, and he was doing so very, very dramatically, getting people to believe in this. And you have to understand, the people of Germany at this time would have been uneducated. They would have very easily believed their authority. So if some member of the church comes rolling into town and says, hey, buy this indulgence, put your name on this piece of paper, and you will go right to heaven when you die, you won't go to purgatory, people would have believed in it. They wouldn't have questioned it. They would have simply believed it. So they were using this money to rebuild St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, which we know the dome on top of was designed by Michelangelo. So an indulgence is a pardon which released a sinner from performing the penalty a priest imposed for sins. That's a long definition, but in a way it's saying one of the penalties you're going to have for all the different sins you have in life is X amount of years in purgatory. Purgatory is that in-between place between heaven and hell. You might have several hundred years that you have to spend in purgatory before you can go to heaven. And so this indulgence basically relieved you of that. Said, hey, if you buy this, you will go directly to heaven. Now, indulgences were not supposed to affect God's right to judge. So if you were a murderer, a rapist, God could still send you to hell. So we got to make that very clear here. So Tetzel gave people the impression that they were buying their way into heaven. And again, if you were an uneducated person in Germany at this time, many people were, you would have taken this at face value. You wouldn't have had the brain power to say, nah, that doesn't seem right. Maybe I shouldn't buy this. Maybe this doesn't seem like something the church should be supporting. That's where Martin Luther comes in. So on October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Thesis on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. Little did he know that that information would be taken, spread via the printing press, And people bought into it. They listened to it. They understood it. It made sense to them. And so Luther's following grew very, very quickly. So the 95 Theses were formal statements attacking pardon merchants. Among the many different grievances he was attacking those who sold indulgences. That's what a pardon merchant is. And he was claiming that this is a practice the church should not believe in. So Martin Luther's actions began the Reformation. This is a caricature of Pope Alexander VI. He was the pope we said in the previous video who had fathered several children. This was drawn by Martin Luther. So you can tell he doesn't have very strong feelings for the pope. Luther's teachings. Luther said that good works were not needed for salvation. The Catholic Church had told people, if you do good, you'll go to heaven. Well, Martin Luther said, well, that's all well and good, but really all a person needs to win salvation, to go to heaven, is all you need is faith. All you have to do is believe. And that was a definite, division from what the church had been preaching for many, many years. He also said church teaching should be based on the Bible, not the Pope or church traditions, which could be corrupt or false. He said, hey, if we look to the Bible, if we look to what it said there, we don't need popes and bishops and people like that to interpret the Bible for us. The word's right there. So we shouldn't have to listen to people who often get things wrong, hence like the indulgences. He basically said, if a pope can start telling people to buy these indulgences, then definitely the pope might be the problem. So why don't we bypass the pope and go right to the Bible for the answers? And so priests are not needed to interpret the Bible because all people with faith were equals. Of course, this is going to be predicated on the idea that you can actually read the Bible. So one of the things we saw in the film Luther, of course, was that he translated the New Testament of the Bible into German. So people in Germany, for the very first time, could actually read and understand the Bible. Before this, the Catholic Church essentially had a monopoly on the Bible because it was written in Latin, sometimes in Greek, and the Catholic Church had the priests and clergy who could speak and read that. Therefore, they were the ones that had to explain it to everybody. That's why you had to go to Mass. That's why you had to go to church. Well, now Martin Luther is basically saying you don't need all of that. Yes, you still can go to church, but you don't need those people to tell you what's in the Bible because now you can read it for yourself. Here's a map of Protestant churches in France in the late 16th century. Basically, France is near Germany, of course, and what we're going to see is Protestant churches growing and growing and growing. Protestant churches are what we're going to get out of this from Martin Luther. So response to Luther. Well, you can imagine, the church is not going to be happy about him. Pope Leo X threatened Luther with excommunication if he didn't recant or take back his statements. Instead of taking the statements back, Luther burned the Pope's decrees. Luther did not back down. As we saw in the film Luther, he basically said it's not right. It's if I'm going to have this education, if I'm going to believe in God, I have to go with my conscience. And if my conscience can't find anything in the Bible that tells me I'm wrong, then I must be right. That was his thinking. So Leo then excommunicated Luther. By that point, he had felt he was separated enough from the Catholic Church that he continued to stick to his teachings and his beliefs. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was a very strong Catholic, summoned Luther to Worms in 1521 to recant or take back his statements. This we saw in the film as well. As we saw, he said, no, I will not recant. I will not take back my statements. And basically Luther became an outlaw at that point because Charles issues the Edict of Worms. The Edict of Worms declared Luther an outlaw and a heretic, and basically said no one was to give him food or shelter. And this would have been difficult for Luther. I mean, if your emperor out there is basically telling you, with the Pope's authority as well, saying that nobody should listen to Luther, nobody should take care of him, you would easily think that Luther, in a way, would be doomed. But that's not the case. Luther had such a strong following at this point that he is definitely going to persevere. Part of the reason he's able to persevere is because he had a very strong ally in Frederick of Saxony. We knew him from the film as Prince Frederick. So Frederick the Wise of Saxony sheltered Luther. We saw he took him in, he took care of him. Even though they hadn't actually met, he's going to protect Luther. So it was there, while Luther was in Prince Frederick's protection, that Luther translated the New Testament of the Bible into German. And that was a huge event for Luther's teachings and for Luther's followers. In 1522, Luther returned to Wittenberg, and his followers became known as Lutherans, a very obvious name after Martin Luther. And we saw this at the end of the film. The princes of Germany banded together. The ones that supported Luther, they banded together to protest against those who were against Luther's ideas, and together they became known as Protestants. Now they're still Christian. They still believe in the Bible. They still believe in Christ. They have a lot in common with Catholics, but they're saying, we're not going to follow your canon law anymore. We're not going to follow your orders. And it was here that when these princes stood up, that Charles V could have cut all their heads off and said, nope, you have to worship in the Roman manner, you have to be Catholics, that's the end of it. But that's not what happened. Charles V listened to their protests, and he allowed them to keep their faith. And that's going to be huge. So what you see here on this map, everything in yellow here is Catholic, and you can see everything in red here is Lutheran or Protestant, and that's only going to grow. Now, there are still very big areas of Europe today that are still very Catholic. Like France is still very Catholic. Spain is still very Catholic. Of course, Germany's got a very strong Protestant following even today. So I don't want you to think that Catholicism was wiped out, because that is not the case whatsoever. I'm going to skip over that map. So that brings us to the end here. Because of Martin Luther's actions, Christianity now has two main branches in the Western world, Catholicism and Protestantism. So you can see, coming from early Christians, you can move down here to Roman Catholics. We branch off to Protestants, and there are several different branches of Protestantism today. These are just some of them: Mormons, Evangelicals, Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutheran. I mean, drive around your city. Drive around and look at all the different churches. Chances are you're going to come across Catholic churches. Like here in Elk River, we have St. Andrew's Catholic Church. We also have literally probably a couple dozen of Protestant churches. Look right across the street from our school. We have Central Lutheran Church. We have the Crossing Church. We have lots of different Lutheran churches in downtown. They're all part of the Protestant branch because they're not Catholic anymore. So they're all Christian, but they are part of the Protestant branch. That would not have been possible if it hadn't been for what Martin Luther did to step up and stand up to the church. All right, let's take a second look at our constructive response question to bring this story to a close. Question says, identify the reasons that drove Martin Luther to write the 95 Theses and describe the outcome of that action. Well, of course, the main reason, and we saw this in the film Luther, and it's in our lecture notes, the main reason he wrote the 95 Theses was, of course, his dissatisfaction with indulgences. And remember, an indulgence was seen as kind of a ticket to heaven. You'd pay the church, and they would ensure your spot in heaven. And Martin Luther saw no scriptural support for that. So he spoke out about it. But the 95 Theses were about a lot of different things. Certainly we know he saw church corruption, he saw prostitution, he saw popes that weren't necessarily taking care of the people, and there was wealth and other things involved, popes having children and being seen as warriors. So there are a lot of different problems that existed within the church that led Martin Luther to write the 95 Theses. But indulgences certainly is at the top of that list. And describe the outcome of that action. Well, it's the Reformation. I mean, the Reformation is the movement that comes from the followers that read and believe in Martin Luther's works. And the biggest result of even that Reformation is we get the split between Catholics and Protestants. And Catholics are going to remain true to the Roman Catholic Church, and Protestants certainly have their own way of doing things. And we will see later in this unit what it means to be a Catholic and what it means to be a Protestant. But if we really want to answer the second half of that question, we have to mention the Reformation. We have to mention the split between Catholics and Protestants. So that should be a pretty good overview of Martin Luther's story as well as how to answer that question. So that's going to do it for us here today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.